Okay, that was recorded yesterday from the US, and Doug Rushkoff has written 10 books about internet and culture and how it's reshaping our world. And actually, I think he's a little bit depressed on the subject. He thinks we have to start from scratch. So now we're going to open this up to questions, but first I think we're going to do a little bit of introduction for each of us to say a little bit who we are and what we're about.
Yeah, hi, I'm Becky Hogge, and when I'm not secretary to David Cameron, I'm a writer and activist. I used to run the Open Rights Group, and I'm still involved in their work. They have a stall just outside. I'd recommend you go and find out what they do. They're basically fighting to protect civil liberties online. I've just written a book called Barefoot into Cyberspace, which examines hacker culture and speaks, hopefully, to an audience such as the audience gathered here, people who aren't necessarily involved in technology, as I have been, but who are interested in radical culture and in turning people from consumers back into participants in life. And that's me, and hopefully that gives me a little bit of authority to speak about some of the fairly nebulous issues that we've tried to raise so far and pull that together in a bit of useful discussion. So hi, that's me.
Bill.
I'm Bill Thompson. I'm a writer, journalist, pundit, talking head, recovering programmer with a background in technology and politics and activism, and trying to interpret and understand what these digital technologies are capable of, and help us all come to terms with them and use them for good rather than evil.
Thank you. My name's Hamish, and I used to work for Undercurrents for many years doing video activism to make the world a better place. Amplifying the voices of people doing very naughty and creative and ethical things and making videos about it and then distributing them as wide as possible. Nowadays I do visionontv, which is an internet, is aggregating and building an internet, making video work in a kind of peer-to-peer way on the internet. So we're going to throw this open to questions from the floor. Do we have to save the internet? Is there a battle for the internet? And if so, what can you do about it?
I think not just questions from the floor, because that would imply falsely that either Becky or I actually had some answers that we could offer that you could take with you and implement. And apart from saying, if you can't already learn how to write code, I have no real advice that is that practical. What I was rather hoping is that you would all have some good insights and understanding into what is going on at the moment, that we have. This network exists. The internet is out there. I suspect all of us in this room spend a lot of time in that strange liminal place between online and offline, where it's impossible to tell whether your last conversation was with somebody in the same room as you or in another continent who happened just to be tweeting remarkably eloquently that evening. And that space is shaping the world in all sorts of ways, from the available forms of political activism and engagement through to how we entertain ourselves, the way we get jobs, the way we educate our children. Everything is being shaped in various ways by it, and we do have control over it. We made this thing, we can change it, but the power does increasingly lie in the hands of the large psychopathic corporations we were hearing about earlier from Noam Chomsky, and seems to lie less in the hands of those of us who might want to use it, as I said at the start, for good. I don't think that we should despair. I think that the network creates possibilities that we can start to explore, and in particular, that what is happening at the moment is the emergence of a digital culture which will be as important going forward the next 500 years or so as print culture was and as literacy was 5,000 years ago. And we can shape that digital culture. Indeed, those of us who are ahead of the curve have a bigger voice because we understand it more. And so there is a historical moment in which we can start to set the direction of travel and ensure that everyone else at least understands what it is we're getting at. So I would rather hear from everybody here and share ideas than act as if I have, in any sense, some answers for you.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, Douglas Rushkoff, one of the sort of lines I wrote down from what he was saying was that the net helps us liberate ourselves, and that's true still to a certain extent. But it's also one of the founding myths that Rushkoff and his generation of net utopians that are responsible for, and is less and less sort of the reality that users are facing today. There are a number of reasons we can see for that, and I think Bill's right to kind of flag corporations having a more dominant position online as part of that. But I see we've got someone who wants to join the conversation.
Hi, you can tell me if this is off topic. Can we talk about physical infrastructure?
Yeah, I think we should talk about physical infrastructure, for sure.
Okay, it might be skipping some prior topics, but my opinion is software is easy, in the sense that you can sit at your computer at home and you can learn how to do it. What you can't do is dig up the roads and put fibre in, or whatever you need to communicate with people.
They get cross if you try it.
Yeah. So, I know there are some cities in the you probably know more about this, there's some cities in the US that are experimenting with community fibre and even buying over the old, the copper systems that the telcos don't want to take care of anymore. How does one go about organising that? And can you just talk? And if anyone else knows anything about that or can tell us more about that, that would be great.
Well, I mean, it's not just in the US. Here in the UK as well, there are community fibre organisations. The Community Broadband Network has done an enormous job of making people aware of what can be done. If it's not digging up trenches and putting fibre down, then certainly it's organising high-speed Wi-Fi and other connectivity. You're right that in a sense, if there's hope, it has to start from having a connection. You have to be able to move the bits around. What those bits mean is a secondary question. If you can't get them, if you can't exchange them, if you're not online in the first place, then you have no access and no power. And so we shouldn't disregard that. I was at an event recently. I was talking about open source, and somebody criticised me for having done a presentation using Apple Keynote, and I pointed out that I was also using, an Intel processor. That there's a level beyond which you cannot, at the moment, assert complete control over the technologies that are in your hands, but we should be taking it down as far as we can. And if the spirit of community organising and grassroots politics means anything, it does mean taking control as far down the chain as you can get. So I don't have an answer to it. I think it's a really interesting question. I wonder if anybody else is involved in any of these initiatives.
My question is kind of related about physical infrastructure and how we're relying on the internet to kind of communicate with each other. I'm becoming less reliant on kind of older technology like using the postal system and things like that. I wonder in this situation how important it is to think about an alternative as well, something which isn't necessarily digital but also allows us to communicate. If say companies who are taking control of networks in other countries, they might take control of networks here. How can we kind of combat that? And is it reliant about making community networks? Is this something we should be talking about as well?
I think particularly this is of particular importance when we're talking about trust networks and social networks, and making sure that your social graph, as it were, isn't only the possession of some company, isn't only logged at Facebook or at Twitter, that actually, I wanted to kind of come in on what you were saying earlier, Bill, about infrastructure and about the right to connect, and certainly the kind of radical hacker community that I've been observing over the last 2 or 3 years whilst writing my book are very ambitious and aspirational around putting, taking control of connectivity hardware. I don't know if it's worth talking about mesh networking and some of the applications that they're building so that people can mesh network. But Rob Congrep, who gave a talk at the Chaos Communications Congress in December last year, talked very much as well about having working trust relationship with as diverse a group of people as also being a strategy to combat this sort of corporate takeover of the web. So I don't know if that speaks to what you were saying, but I think that's a really interesting point of view and definitely one that's worth airing in terms of this conversation.
I mean, do you have any suggestions yourself for what could be an alternative, apart from obviously carrier pigeons and tattooing messages on your head and letting your hair grow back, both of which I believe are very effective?
But computer hardware, for example, I see a lot more hackers working with their own hardware. Stuff like Arduino and this sort of thing has really sparked the imagination of the computer hacking community for exactly this reason, I think, and also for the fact that they've been building software and giving it away for ages, and now they feel like there's a way for them to monetize their software by selling it on the basis of these little chips. But these two drivers, I think, am I talking rubbish? What do you think?
So
you're being very silent, which makes me think that you disagree.
I think there's a lot of
me.
obsolete computer hardware out there which could be reused in creative ways. So I think there's a lot of junk, and maybe we could use that to build something.
Well, it's no longer junk. there is this confluence, I suppose, that because of Moore's law, because the speed of the available hardware increases so quickly, there is kit which is deemed to be redundant for commercial or industrial use or for high-speed gaming, whatever, that is in fact remains perfectly serviceable. And those of us who care about the sustainable world and environmental issues, and about not just sending all this off to be landfill in dumps in China, would like to see it being recycled, reused, repurposed in some way. At the same time, there's a whole load of free software around that allows that to happen, and there is a political will to take control. And so to have a machine that was designed and built before the architectures of control were asserted on it, that doesn't have the hardware control of its video display to ensure you can't illicitly display any high-definition content on an unlicensed monitor, like current systems, to have access to that kit, to have software which is not bloated so can make it usable, and to serve a political purpose with it, all makes real sense.
It does. So head down to your junk markets and buy up all that old stuff. For
No. Head to the skips outside the large corporations and take it for nothing.
All right,
and if you're lucky, you'll get some dirty data on their dealings in the bargain.
Which you can then sell on the open market to cover the costs of your later investment.
I'm Jay Baker from Science Breakers in Sheffield, and ironically I did have a question, but that's exactly what we do. We're a community media social enterprise, and we charge corporations for the privilege of taking away their discarded, disused computer junk, rebuild it and recondition it, and teach community members to put open source software on there. So they're basically getting the kit and the software and the skills and the tools to sustainably run their own community media projects. Yeah. So that's really interesting that you've just said that, because that's like, oh, that's what we do, but it's kind of like Robin Hood media that we take from them and then give it into the communities.
Say the name of your organisation again. So
it's Silence Breakers.
Silence Breakers.
Yeah. Is that a plug? Silencebreakers.org if anyone wants to take a look.
Do you have another point you want to make?
Yeah, what I was going to say is, since the 1950s, there's sort of been this tug of war between sort of citizenship and consumerism, more than ever, I think, and that's really reflected in the internet and social media, online. You can see that in sort of Facebook, and what's really poignant with the Occupy Wall Street stuff lately as well is that we're hearing stories of Facebook and the likes of those pulling video footage of this poorly reported on activism that's sweeping across the United States. So how do you battle against that? And if you use an alternative web stream or website, who's going to know about it? So it's that struggle of awareness and flow of information.
No, you've put your finger on a really important point, which is, your organisation goes and liberates some hardware and rebuilds it and refurbishes it and puts Linux on it and Firefox on it, and the first thing someone does when they get it is sign up for Facebook. And you go, no. So, but they will, because that's where everybody is. And I mean, I thought when Eric Schmidt, the former chief exec of Google, was asked about the battle that Google is undergoing with its users at the moment about real names on the Google Plus service, and he said, Google's optional, you don't have to use it, we'll do what we like there. And of course it's not true. They have an effective monopoly because they are the place people are. Now, some years ago, in fact, I think it was about 2003, I wrote an article calling for Google to be regulated by Ofsearch, the Office of Search Engines. I believe that the government has a role, I believe the state can do good, and it was a nice provocative thing to call for. But my argument was and remains that search as carried out by Google is as much a public utility as electricity or water. And so Google should be required to be transparent about what it does in some ways.
I think that's right. Oh, there we go. Silence break.
And so perhaps the thing you do is not to leave it to the market, because the market will always screw you.
Yeah, I think this is, I guess, going back to my original point about the early internet utopians and how all the things that they promised the internet would do for radical media actually didn't turn out to be all that all that revolutionary in the end, and this is one of the issues. And we see that radical media is facing just the same problems that it always faces, which is how can we get an audience big enough for what we're saying when everybody else is looking in the opposite direction towards these more consumer products like Facebook. And then again, you talk about regulation. Some of the answers that people in the human rights and regulatory community that I sort of work with now and again are looking towards answers like the Global Network Initiative, which is basically an exercise in corporate social responsibility between human rights organisations and big business. Well, we've been here before, so you know it turns out that stuff wasn't that revolutionary, but that doesn't mean we should stop trying.
Mike Gold, I think it's interesting that we nowadays think in terms of the internet as being a social media. The internet and computers have always been for business. The only alteration to that is that most of the money originally came from governments for defence equipment, for defence expenditure, for the space programmes, and as a byproduct became the commercial side, so that all the original real-time projects were in space, missiles, etc. The first real-time commercial project in Britain was reservations for the old British European Airways. Now, what has happened is we are conning ourselves in believing that this structure is there for our use. And when the point is made about having to develop our own hardware, it's absolutely correct, because Google, Facebook, Yahoo, all of them are insecure, and they can be turned off, as you were doing in your sketch earlier. And not only can it be turned off, it is far, far worse, because they can actually take what you're doing there. The tracking that different companies, never mind the security services, are putting on your computers every time you use them. They have so much information, they can call it a profile, but there is they can say this is the profile of the normal user. And for the media, a radical media, for activists, for old-fashioned Marxists like me, to actually think in terms that the internet is offering us anything. Somebody was making the point earlier about communicating. The way you communicate is with other human beings. The idea that you can communicate through a screen with people that you don't know, through, and I say with the Twitter as well, through that number of characters never allows you to communicate. It just allows you to make little noises. There is no depth or reality in the communication. And what's got to be done is we have to actually change the society. And until we change the society, the debates about how we use the internet are actually nothing more than academic, because it's not going to make a real difference. People may have got to Wall Street because of information on the internet in some way, but what they've actually had to do is physically go to Wall Street. You can't alter anything by sitting in front of a screen. The Arab Spring was based on actually getting there, not sitting at home saying, I support it. And what I would like to see from a younger generation is to actually get rid of this reliance on the internet and actually, it's maybe going too far to say, but get a life.
I'm afraid I don't agree. Were you supporting him or me? Somebody wants the microphone over there. Why don't we...
Can we have a woman? Because we've had lots of men speaking.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
I'd like to respond to that eventually, but let's get some more points of view.
Yeah, I'd like to address both of these things. On the one hand, I really want to hear more about your optimism about how this can be used better despite the state and corporate control of the internet. On the other, I want to answer what was just said, in part at least. Part of my tendency towards I have a lot of ambiguous feelings about the internet, and partly it's because my primary area of activism surrounds Iran. Now, in Iran, we've all, I think we're probably pretty well aware of how much the regime there has done to use the internet to ensnare people and jail them. And that is a horrific fact. On the other hand, activists throughout Iran and the world, and this is primarily people who are outside of Iran, but it does get into Iran as well, are having very much of a deep discussion through the use of Pal Talk. They have live meetings with each other, and people can be anywhere in the world and involved in these meetings, and there are very serious discussions going on about what the strategy should be and what the real questions are. And it's a hugely democratic debate in a way that is unprecedented in Iranian society, whether it's abroad, outside of Iran, that is, or inside Iran, for all the historical reasons we know. So that's something that gives me a bit of hope. The other side of that, of course, is that we know that I find it impossible to believe that that isn't being listened to by all the wrong people as well as the right people. And probably there are attempts to manipulate it as well. So my question goes to, how can we use this safely or make it as safer medium? I just can't even get myself near Facebook. But what do we use? What are the better ways to use it? What are the things to avoid?
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I think that's basically almost, I feel those are the same questions expressed in two very different ways, because my immediate reaction to you, sir, was Facebook, Twitter, this is not the internet, at least in the way that either of us are here to understand it or talk about it or defend it today. And just as those from outside of the radical media community may not know all that much about the radical media and the publications that are coming out of this community, similarly, those outside of the radical technology culture probably think that the beginning and end, just like your people who get these refurbished computers and immediately load up Facebook, think that the internet is Facebook and Twitter. And certainly, if that's all it was, then I don't suppose I would be sitting here today. And I think that there are technologies out there that do enable, and you've spoken about some of them, and others that I would mention would be things like Tor, the anonymization network, things like internet relay chat, just being able, if you can set up your own infrastructure, email clients, these things are very powerful organizational tools. I don't know whether I believe him to this extent, but when I interviewed Cory Doctorow, who grew up in the activist community as things were going sort of digital, he said that Apache and Mailman, these two open source internet technologies, took about 70 to 80% of the load out of organizing, because suddenly you weren't stuffing envelopes anymore, you were sending email. And I think that we forget that actually when we have these kind of discussions about where we are now with, again, the mainstream going to these checkbox consumer-like applications, and we say, okay, that's the internet now. But it's not quite the case. And if you look at people who are using technology, who completely understand the technology and who are using it in a radical way, they are engaging in new forms of civil disobedience, digital civil disobedience. I agree that you still need to put your body in the way, and that's how you come across political change. But if you look at Europe versus Facebook at the moment, where people are essentially initiating a denial of service attack on Facebook by using their rights to demand the data that Facebook holds on them through the Data Protection Act, and that's, exposing the company and taking up a lot of their time. And then also things like the anonymous DDoS attacks on PayPal was again a new form of civil disobedience that we're seeing online. But that's just a small point to make. I agree that you do need to still get physical and get a life, but I disagree that these technologies, when used correctly, don't help. I recommend a session that I think is going on in the second part of this afternoon called How to Escape the Hamster Cage, which is a briefing on non-corporate technologies which are useful in activism for that. And I'd also, as a child of Thatcher, as someone who was born in 1979, I don't know if I'm going to be able to express this very clearly, but from a personal perspective, I found that the outside world did scare me a little bit by the time I was growing up into it as a teenager, and that being able to connect with people from behind the screen, at least initially, gave me the courage to go out and seek out like minds and engage in activism. And I'm not sure if the technology had been there, whether in the little enclave that I grew up in, I would have had the courage to do that. I don't know if that's very well expressed, but yeah, that's how I feel about it.
And can I just, before Martin comes in, just say that I'd agree with everything Becky said, and I think she said it very eloquently, and we are just at the start. We are beginning to develop the tools that will allow for deeper engagement, that will be safe from prying eyes, that will allow us to build networks around the world that will campaign, that will go out there and that will change the world. It's not like this is a finished set of tools that we are working with. We are making new things up as well.
Hi. Obviously the ability of the internet to enable the free flow of information around our society is very worrying to governments and probably to some of our radical Marxist friends, of whom I have none. But it is certainly true to say that the entire viability of democracy itself, it's not hyperbolic to say that hangs in the balance in these debates over the architecture of the internet and whether that enables control or prevents it. Do you find, or do you think that some of the sectarianism that we see within the debate about this, open rights groups saying we can't use this argument in this consultation response because it's a conservative argument, do you find that might be holding back the ability of people in this community to influence the debate and have the effect on public policy that they ought to have?
Wow. I have to say I wasn't aware that anyone had said that an argument can be used based on its political origin who was connected to the Open Rights Group. If that happened, I've never publicly condemned anything the Open Rights Group has done since I was executive director, but I'd be very willing to do that. I think what really drew me into digital politics in the first place was the fact that kind of sectarianism is absent. Realistically, as it matures as a field, I think we have to expect that sectarianism to bleed into it. I don't think we can avoid that, but I certainly would hope that I would never. It would be my ambition not to fall into those patterns.
Sure, it wasn't.
You're a good sectarian
really.
man. What do you think?
That the political systems and processes that have developed up till now cannot be sustained as the network becomes pervasive. They simply don't work. That political parties, as we understand them, do not function in this world that we are building on the affordances, on the capabilities of the network for many, many reasons, not least that the ways we organise are different, that the access to information we have is different, that our ability to engage in discussions and deliberate and make choices is amplified by those tools. And the parties evolved to solve a particular problem about organising large numbers of people to come to some consensus about policy which could then be carried out by representatives, and that problem has to a large extent gone away. And so we have the solution still sitting there, and the underlying problem doesn't exist, and the solution doesn't know what to do. It's exactly the same issue that faces newspapers. The problem that newspapers solve doesn't exist anymore. That's why they're all going out of business. The thing that political parties have evolved to do doesn't need to be done in that way anymore, and we don't yet have alternatives. One of the nice things about today is to see a lot of people who are thinking seriously about both the media and the political alternatives, about what we do if this is the world, about how we make it better in that situation. And again, I said at the start, I do not have the answers, but I think there's some really great questions. When it comes to the media sphere, I think we're going to go through a period of crisis. I think it's going to be 10 years of hell. I think if you want to be a corrupt politician, now is your chance. Because the opportunities for people to investigate and figure out what you're doing and expose it are going to be much reduced. So that's the way to make money for the next decade. It's corrupt politics. After that, we may have new forms of media.